Have you ever felt remembered? Not in a clear way, not through a message, not through a call, but in a quiet, almost unexplainable way, like someone, somewhere is thinking about you, especially at night, when everything slows down, when the noise of the day disappears. When your mind finally has space to breathe, have you noticed how certain thoughts only show up then? Not during the day, not when you're busy, but when you're alone and everything is still and suddenly someone appears in your mind, without effort, without reason, without warning. You weren't trying to think about them. You weren't looking for a memory, and yet they're there, clear, familiar, almost as if they never really left. And for a moment, it feels different from a normal thought, heavier, more present, almost like it came from somewhere outside of you. Have you ever paused and wondered why that happens? Why certain people return to your mind again and again, while others fade so easily? Why some connections disappear, but others remain quietly active? And the deeper question, what if it's not just you? What if, at the same moment, while you're lying there thinking about them, they're thinking about you too? Not intentionally, not consciously, but because something deeper connected that moment. Because sometimes it doesn't feel like you created the thought. It feels like you received it, and that's what makes it hard to ignore, because it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's subtle, but it stays. And the more you notice it, the harder it becomes to call it random. So what is really happening in those quiet moments? Why do certain people return again and again, when everything else fades away? And why does it happen most at night? Not during distraction, not during noise, but in silence, as if something is waiting for you to finally notice it. Let's slow this down for a moment, because what you're experiencing is not something strange, it's not something to be embarrassed about, and it's definitely not something that means you're stuck or unable to move on. There is nothing wrong with you. In fact, what you're feeling is more natural than you've probably been told. The problem is, most people don't talk about it. And because they don't talk about it, you're left trying to understand it on your own. So you start questioning yourself. You start wondering, why am I still thinking about this person? Why now? Why at night? And sometimes that questioning turns into quiet judgment. You tell yourself you should be over it. You tell yourself it doesn't make sense. You tell yourself to stop. But the thought still comes back, not aggressively, not constantly, but consistently enough that you notice it. And when something repeats like that, it doesn't feel random. It feels meaningful. But here's where most people get it wrong. They think repeated thought means attachment, or weakness, or unfinished business. So they try to fight it. They distract themselves. They fill their time. They try to replace the thought with something else. But that approach doesn't solve anything. It only adds pressure, because now, you're not just experiencing the thought, you're resisting it. And resistance makes everything feel heavier, not lighter. So instead of understanding what's happening, you create conflict with it. You turn something subtle into something stressful, and that's where confusion begins. Because the more you try to push the thought away, the more present it feels. Not because it's getting stronger, but because your attention is now fixed on it. So let's remove that pressure. Let's remove the idea that this is something you need to fix. Because it isn't. You don't need to force yourself to stop thinking about someone. You don't need to judge yourself for it. And you definitely don't need to assume it means something is wrong. What you're experiencing is simply a pattern of awareness, a pattern that becomes visible when everything else becomes quiet. And that's important, because during the day, your mind is occupied. You're focused on tasks, on responsibilities, on conversations, on movement. There's no space, no stillness, no pause. But at night, that changes. The distractions fade, the structure of the day dissolves, and your mind returns to what's been sitting beneath the surface. Thoughts you didn't have time to notice, feelings you didn't fully process, connections you didn't completely understand. They don't suddenly appear at night. They were already there. Night simply reveals them. So if someone keeps appearing in your thoughts during that time, it doesn't mean the night is creating something new. It means the night is removing everything that was hiding it. And when you see it from that perspective, it becomes less confusing, less emotional, less overwhelming, because now you're not asking, why is this happening to me? You're simply observing, this is what's already there. And observation is very different from reaction, because when you observe something, you don't immediately try to control it. You don't rush to change it. You don't assign it meaning too quickly. You just notice, and in that noticing, clarity begins. Now let's go deeper, because there's another layer to this that most people overlook. Not all thoughts carry the same weight. Most thoughts pass quickly. You think about something and it disappears, but certain thoughts stay. They repeat, they return, and when they do, it's usually because something deeper is attached to them. Not necessarily emotion in the dramatic sense, but impression, an imprint that hasn't faded, and the mind naturally returns to what is still active. So when someone appears in your thoughts repeatedly, it's not because you're forcing it. It's because something about that connection hasn't been fully released. Now, that doesn't mean you need to do anything about it. It doesn't mean you need to reach out, or revisit the past, or change your life in any way. It simply means that connection still exists at some level. And again, that's not something to judge. It's something to understand. Because once you understand it, you stop creating unnecessary pressure around it. You stop labeling it as a problem. You stop trying to fix something that isn't broken. Instead, you allow it to exist without resistance. And that changes everything. Because the moment you stop resisting a thought, it loses intensity. Not because it disappears immediately, but because you're no longer feeding it with tension. You're no longer reacting to it. You're simply aware of it. Is calm. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It doesn't assume. It just sees clearly. So if someone appears in your thoughts tonight, don't fight it. Don't analyze it too quickly. Don't turn it into a problem. Just notice it. Let it pass through your awareness, without attaching pressure to it. Because in that calm observation, you begin to separate yourself from the confusion around it. And once that happens, you're no longer caught in the experience. You're understanding it. And that's where everything starts to shift. Not by force, not by control, but by clarity. Most people believe that thoughts are simple, personal, contained. They assume that what happens in the mind stays in the mind, that if you're thinking about someone, it must be coming from you, your memory, your emotions, your past. And on the surface, that explanation feels reasonable. It's logical, comfortable, easy to accept. But if you look a little closer, that explanation doesn't fully hold, because not all thoughts behave the same way. Some thoughts are intentional. You choose them, you direct them, you follow them. But others appear without effort, without planning, without clear cause. And those are the ones people don't understand, because they don't fit the idea of control. They don't follow the rules we've been taught about thinking. So we label them as random, or we ignore them, or we try to force them into a familiar explanation. But what if they're not random at all? What if they're simply not understood? Because here's something worth noticing. If thoughts were completely isolated, they would follow predictable patterns. You would only think about what you deliberately focus on. You would only recall what you actively choose to remember. But that's not how it works. Sometimes, you're fully focused on something else, and suddenly someone enters your mind. Clear, specific, present, and it interrupts your attention. Not aggressively, but noticeably. And you didn't choose it, so where did it come from? Most people answer that question too quickly. They say, it's just memory. But memory doesn't behave like that. Memory usually needs a trigger, a reminder, a connection, something to activate it. But these moments often come without any of that. No visible cause, no obvious link, just a sudden awareness. And when something happens repeatedly like that, it's worth questioning the assumption behind it. Because the real issue isn't the thought itself, it's the way we interpret it. Most people fall into one of two extremes. They either dismiss it completely, or they overreact to it. They either say, "It means nothing," or they say, "It must mean everything." But both of those responses miss something important, because they're both reactions. And reactions don't create clarity, they create distortion. When you dismiss something too quickly, you lose the opportunity to understand it. When you overinterpret something, you add meaning that may not actually be there. So instead of reacting, we need to observe and ask a different kind of question, not, "Why can't I stop thinking about this person?" but, "What is sustaining this thought?" Because sustained thoughts are different from random ones. They repeat, they return, they persist. And persistence usually points to something active, something ongoing, something that hasn't settled. Now, here's where the shift begins. Instead of assuming that every thought originates entirely from you, consider the possibility that thought can also be influenced, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but subtly, quietly, in a way that blends into your own awareness. Because think about this, if someone is thinking about you intensely, repeatedly, with emotion, do you really believe that has no effect at all? That it simply stays contained within them, with no interaction, no reflection, no response? That assumption might be too limited, because we already know that attention creates connection. We know that focus strengthens awareness. We know that repeated thought builds patterns. So why would that suddenly stop at the boundary of one individual? What if it doesn't? What if the mind is not as isolated as we've been taught? What if it's more connected, more responsive, more interactive? Because when you begin to consider that, something changes. You stop seeing thoughts as completely private, and you start seeing them as part of a larger process, not chaotic, not uncontrollable, but interconnected. And this doesn't mean every thought is coming from somewhere else. That's not the point. The point is, not every thought is entirely self-generated either. Some are influenced, some are triggered, some are activated by patterns that extend beyond your immediate awareness. And when those patterns repeat, they create familiarity, they create recognition, they create that feeling of, "This isn't random." So instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the question becomes, "What pattern is being repeated here?" Because patterns tell you more than individual moments. They reveal consistency, and consistency reveals cause. Not always obvious, not always direct, but present. And once you begin to see that, you stop fighting the experience, you stop labeling it as a problem, and you start understanding it as information. Because that's what it is. Not something to fear, not something to chase, but something to observe. Carefully, calmly, without rushing to conclusions. Because the moment you shift from reaction to observation, everything becomes clearer. You no longer feel confused by the thought. You're curious about it, you're aware of it, and awareness is where real understanding begins. Not in force, not in control, but in seeing what's actually there, without trying to immediately change it. And once you reach that point, you're ready to understand something deeper, something most people never consider, but once seen, explains everything differently. There is a principle that has been described in many ways, across different teachings, different philosophies, and different periods of time, but at its core, it points to something very simple. The mind is not as separate as we think. Joseph Murphy spoke about this often, not in a complicated way, not in a mystical way meant to confuse, but in a practical, grounded understanding of how the subconscious works. He explained that the subconscious mind is not limited to the individual. It doesn't function in isolation. It operates within a larger field of influence, a shared level of awareness, where impressions are received, stored, and expressed. And most people never think about that, because we're taught to believe that our thoughts are private, that what happens inside us stays inside us. But Murphy suggested something different. He described the subconscious as responsive, open, influenced by suggestion, belief, and repeated thought, but also connected. Because the subconscious does not rely on logic, it does not require physical interaction. It responds to impression, An impression is created through feeling, not just thought, feeling. Because thought alone is weak, it passes quickly. But thought combined with feeling becomes something else. It becomes an imprint, something that doesn't fade easily, something that carries weight. And according to this principle, when a thought is repeated with emotion, with focus, with consistency, it doesn't just stay within one person. It strengthens, it deepens, and it begins to project, not in a dramatic way, not in a way you can see or measure easily, but in a way that influences awareness. Because the subconscious mind is receptive, it is constantly picking up impressions, not just from your own thoughts, but from patterns of thought that are directed with enough intensity. Now, this is where most people misunderstand. They think influence requires action, words, communication, physical presence. But the subconscious doesn't operate on those levels, it operates beneath them, at the level of impression. So if someone is thinking about you every night, with consistency, with emotional focus, that thought is not neutral. It carries a signal, not a loud one, not something obvious, but something steady, and steady patterns have influence. Now consider this. When is your subconscious most open? Not during the day, not when you're busy, not when your mind is occupied with tasks and responsibilities. It's open when the conscious mind becomes quiet, when control relaxes, when logic steps back. And that happens most at night. When you're no longer actively directing your attention, when you're no longer filtering every thought, when the surface level of the mind softens and deeper patterns begin to emerge. That's when impressions have the clearest pathway, because there is less resistance, less interference, less noise. So if someone is holding you in their mind, night after night, that repetition builds, it becomes a pattern. And patterns seek expression. They don't stay dormant forever. They move toward awareness, not aggressively, but naturally. And that awareness may show up in a very specific way, as a thought, your thought about them. That's the important part. It doesn't feel like something external. It feels like it came from you. Because the subconscious doesn't label origin. It doesn't separate mine from yours. It only registers impression and expresses it in a form you can recognize, which is thought. So when you suddenly think about someone at night, without trying, without reason, it may not be entirely self-generated. It may be a response, a reflection, an activation of a pattern that is being reinforced from another direction. Now, this doesn't mean every thought works this way. That's not the point. The point is that consistent, emotionally charged thought carries influence. And when that influence is repeated, it becomes easier to receive, especially when your mind is quiet enough to notice it. And this explains something many people experience, but don't understand. That sense of someone appearing in your awareness at specific times, without effort, without clear cause. And once you understand this principle, it changes how you see those moments. They stop feeling random, they stop feeling confusing, and they start feeling consistent, not because they are loud or obvious, but because they follow a pattern. A quiet, steady pattern that becomes visible only when you know what to look for. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's not something new. It's something that was always happening, just outside your awareness until now. So now we can bring everything together, clearly, simply, without confusion. This is why someone may be thinking about you every night, and you begin to feel it, not as a direct message, not as something obvious, but as a repeated thought that appears in your own mind. Because thought, when combined with feeling, and repeated consistently, becomes an impression, and impression does not stay still. It doesn't remain contained within one person. It moves, quietly, subtly, but consistently. And when it reaches a certain level of intensity, it becomes easier to receive, not consciously, but subconsciously. And that's the key to understanding this, because what you experience doesn't feel like it's coming from someone else. It feels like your own thought. That's why it's so easy to misunderstand. You assume, I'm thinking about them, but the deeper truth may be, you are responding to a pattern of thought that is already active. Because the subconscious mind does not question origin. It doesn't ask, did this start with me or someone else? It simply receives impression and expresses it in a form you can recognize, which is thought. So when someone is holding you in their mind, night after night, with consistency, with emotion, with focus, that creates a steady pattern, and steady patterns create access. Not forced, not dramatic, but available, especially when your mind becomes quiet, because during the day, your conscious mind filters everything. It selects, it organizes, it blocks out what doesn't seem relevant. But at night, that filter softens, the structure relaxes, and what is usually unnoticed becomes visible, or more accurately, noticeable. That's why it often happens then. Not because night creates the connection, but because night removes the resistance to it. So what you experience in those moments is not something new being created. It's something that was already present, becoming clear. And that clarity shows up as thought. Your thought about them. Now here's where the real shift happens. Because once you understand this, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, why can't I stop thinking about them? And you start asking, what pattern is being repeated here? Because repetition is never random. It always points to something active, something ongoing, something being sustained, and in this case, it may not be sustained by you alone. It may be sustained by attention, from both directions. That's why it feels different. That's why it doesn't fade easily. That's why it returns, even when you're not trying to hold on to it. Because it's not only your focus that's keeping it alive. It's a shared pattern of attention, and shared attention creates connection even in silence, even without contact, even without awareness on both sides. And this is where most people get uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea of separation. It challenges the idea that everything happening in your mind is entirely yours. But once you understand this principle, it becomes easier to accept, not as something mystical, not as something exaggerated, but as something subtle and consistent, because you've already experienced it, you've felt it. That moment when someone appears in your thoughts, without effort, without intention, and it feels different from a normal memory, more present, more immediate, more real. That's not imagination. That's awareness of something active. Now, this doesn't mean you need to act on it. It doesn't mean you need to reach out. It doesn't mean you need to change anything in your life. Understanding is enough, because understanding removes confusion, and when confusion is gone, you stop reacting to the experience. You stop labeling it as a problem. You stop trying to force it disappear. Instead, you see it clearly, as a pattern, as a connection, as something that exists without needing your control. And that changes your relationship with it completely, because now you're not caught in the question. You're aware of the process, and awareness is always calmer than confusion. So the next time it happens, the next time someone appears in your thoughts at night, you don't need to fight it. You don't need to analyze it. You simply recognize it. A pattern of attention, a reflection of impression, a connection that exists quietly, but consistently. And once you see it that way, it no longer feels overwhelming. It feels understood. And that understanding is where everything begins to shift. There are moments in life that don't feel loud or dramatic, but they stay with you, not because they demand attention, but because they repeat quietly. And over time, that repetition becomes difficult to ignore. A man once shared something simple, nothing extraordinary on the surface. He hadn't spoken to someone in years, no contact, no updates, no reason to think about them. Life had moved forward naturally, completely, and yet, every night, around the same time, that person would appear in his mind, not emotionally overwhelming, not intense, just consistent. At first, he dismissed it, assumed it was memory. But memory doesn't behave like that. Memory fades, it weakens over time. This didn't. It stayed clear, night after night. The same presence, the same awareness, and eventually, it became noticeable enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. Months passed like this, quietly, until one day he received a message unexpected, simple, from that same person. And what stood out wasn't the message itself. It was one sentence. "I don't know why, but I've been thinking about you every night." Another example is less direct, but just as revealing. A woman noticed a pattern in her daily life, not dramatic, but consistent. There was someone she used to know, not someone she actively thought about, not someone she kept in contact with. And yet, every few days, usually at night, he would appear in her thoughts, without effort, without intention, just suddenly, and she started noticing something else. On the days when the thought felt stronger, more present, more noticeable, the next day he would reach out. A message, a call, something small. At first she ignored the connection, called it coincidence, but it happened again and again and again, until the pattern became clear. The thought wasn't random. It was aligned with something active. And then there are quieter moments most people overlook. But once you notice them, they become obvious. You're going about your day, focused, busy, distracted, and suddenly, someone crosses your mind. Not someone you were just thinking about, not someone recently mentioned, just suddenly there, clear, present. And within hours, you see their name, you hear about them, or they contact you. And when it happens once, you ignore it. When it happens twice, you question it. But when it happens repeatedly, you start to notice a pattern. Because patterns are different from coincidences, they repeat, they align, they reveal something consistent. There was also a situation someone described that seemed almost too simple. He would think of a specific person right before going to sleep, not intentionally. It would just happen. And over time, he realized something. The nights when the thought was calm, nothing followed. But the nights when the thought felt stronger, more focused, more present. Within a day or two, there would be some form of contact, not always direct, sometimes indirect, but enough to notice. And once he became aware of it, the experience changed, not because the pattern stopped, but because he understood it. He stopped reacting, stopped questioning, and simply observed. And then there's something even more familiar, something almost everyone has experienced. You think of someone suddenly, and they reach out. You mention someone, and they appear in your life again. You remember someone vividly, and shortly after, something connects you back to them. These are small moments, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away, but when they repeat, they point to something deeper. Because random events don't organize themselves into patterns. Patterns require consistency, and consistency suggests there is something active, something ongoing. None of these stories are exaggerated. They're not dramatic. They don't rely on extreme outcomes. They're quiet, subtle, but consistent. And that's what makes them important. Because the truth doesn't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes it shows up in patterns, small, repeated experiences that only become clear when you pay attention. And once you do, you begin to see something different. That thought is not always isolated. That awareness is not always random. That connection does not always require communication, because sometimes it already exists quietly, consistently, waiting to be noticed. So what do you actually do with this understanding? Not theoretically, not as an idea, but in real life. Because once you see that thought carries influencer, that attention creates connection. You can't go back to being unaware of it. But awareness doesn't mean control. It means responsibility, quiet responsibility. The first shift is simply, you become aware of your own patterns, not to judge them, not to suppress them, but to see them clearly. Because if repeated thought creates impression, then what you consistently hold in your mind matters more than you think, especially when it carries emotion. So instead of asking, why do they keep thinking about me? Also ask, what am I repeatedly thinking about? Because attention moves both ways, and once you recognize that, you stop being passive with your focus. You become intentional, not forcefully, not obsessively, but calmly. You begin to choose where your attention rests, because you understand that where attention goes, impression grows, and where impression grows, connection forms. Now the second shift. When someone appears in your thoughts, don't react immediately. Don't assign meaning too quickly. Don't turn it into a story. Just notice it. That's enough. Because awareness without reaction creates clarity. You don't need to analyze every thought. You don't need to act on every feeling. You simply observe, and in that observation, you separate yourself from unnecessary confusion, because the moment you react, you create interpretation. And interpretation is often influenced by fear, assumption, or past experience, but observation is neutral, calm, clear. It allows you to see the pattern without being pulled into it. So if someone appears in your mind tonight, you don't chase the thought, and you don't push it away. You let it pass through your awareness without resistance. Because resistance gives it weight, and chasing gives it direction, but calm awareness keeps you centered. Now the third shift is deeper. You begin to understand who you are in relation to your thoughts. You are not every thought that appears. You are the one who notices them. And that distinction matters, because once you identify with every thought, you lose clarity. But when you observe thought instead of becoming it, you gain control without force. And that control is quiet. It doesn't try to dominate. It doesn't try to fix everything. It simply remains steady. So instead of being pulled into every pattern of connection, you recognize it, you understand it, but you remain grounded in yourself. And this leads to the most important shift, identity. Because once you understand how thought, attention, and connection work, you are no longer someone who feels confused by these experiences. You are someone who understands them. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you start recognizing. This is how connection works. And that changes how you move through life. You become more intentional, more aware, more calm in situations that once felt uncertain. You stop chasing meaning in every moment, and you stop ignoring patterns that matter. You find balance. Because the goal isn't to control thoughts, and it isn't to depend on them either. It's to understand them, so you can move with clarity, not confusion. Because when you understand something, you don't fear it, and you don't chase it. You simply see it for what it is, a process, a pattern, a reflection of attention. And from that place, you gain something most people never develop: stability, not based on circumstances, not based on other people, but based on awareness. Because you know what's happening, even when it's subtle, even when it's quiet, even when it's not obvious, and that awareness gives you a different kind of confidence, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, the kind that doesn't need validation, because it comes from understanding. So if someone is thinking about you, let it be. You don't need to control it. You don't need to respond to it. You don't need to build a story around it. You simply recognize it as part of a larger pattern, a quiet connection that exists without effort, and at the same time, you remain grounded in your own direction, your own focus, your own clarity. Because the most important thing is not who is thinking about you. It's who you are becoming. And when you understand this fully, you stop being someone who is affected by every thought, and you become someone who understands them, moves with them, but is never controlled by them. Because you are not here to follow every signal. You are here to recognize it, without losing yourself in it. And that's the shift, not in what you experience, but in how you relate to it. You are no longer reacting to thought. You are aware of it. And awareness is where true control begins.